All right. Ready to dive into a topic that's a bit, well, aggressive.
Yeah, we're tackling a big one today, that's for sure.
The age-old question is aggression something we're born with, or is it shaped by the world around us?
Nature versus nurture, right?
Yeah.
Always a fun one.
We're using Erich Fromm's The Anatomy of Human Destructiveness as our guide. And you've pulled in some Konrad Lorenz, too, which Fromm actually critiques pretty heavily.
Yeah, Fromm really goes after Lorenz's book on aggression, which was hugely influential, by the way. Lorenz was all about aggression as this, like, hardwired instinct.
And he compared humans to animals a lot to make that point, right?
Oh, absolutely. And that's one of the things Fromm challenges. Like, remember that story about Lorenz's aunt? The one who he claimed would just get inexplicably aggressive every few months?
I think I vaguely remember that. He used that as evidence for innate aggression in humans.
Yeah, as if humans are just like birds following some predetermined biological clock for aggression. And I was like, hold on a second, it's not that simple.
Right, because human behavior is influenced by so much more than just our biology.
Exactly. Our social structures, our upbringing, our cultural norms, all of that plays a role.
So Fromm felt like Lorenz was oversimplifying things then.
Totally. Like comparing checkers to chess, right? The basic moves might be similar, but the overall game is infinitely more complex. Fromm also wasn't a fan of how behaviorists like B.F. Skinner approach things, the whole rewards and punishments thing.
So Fromm believed that focusing solely on those outward behaviors didn't give us the full picture.
Exactly. He was more interested in digging into the deeper psychological and social factors driving human actions, not just the observable behaviors themselves.
Like those famous psychology experiments, right?
Mhm.
Like the Stanford prison experiment, which, while interesting, don't necessarily capture the full complexity of human behavior in the real world.
Precisely. Fromm was always wary of reducing human beings to just stimulus and response. He felt we were much more than that.
So he was pushing for a more holistic view then.
Definitely. And this leads us to a really interesting part of your deep dive aggression in what Fromm calls primitive societies, those early hunter-gatherer groups. Because there's this common assumption that those societies were just inherently violent and chaotic.
Right, like some real-life Lord of the Flies situation.
Exactly. But what Fromm found might surprise you.
So it wasn't all just survival of the fittest and constant warfare.
Not quite. Fromm actually found that many hunter-gatherer societies were surprisingly peaceful. They really relied on cooperation and sharing to survive.
Wow, so the opposite of that primitive man stereotype we often hear about.
Yeah, like Fromm talks about the Zuni Indians, for instance.
Mhm.
They emphasized cooperation and peaceful conflict resolution.
So aggression was like frowned upon in their culture.
Yeah, pretty much the opposite of what we might expect. But to be fair, Fromm didn't find that every single prehistoric society was completely peaceful.
Right, there had to be some variation,
Yeah.
right?
Exactly. It's way more nuanced than just saying all early humans were peaceful or all were aggressive. Like, he contrasts the Zuni with the Dogu Islanders from Papua New Guinea. They were much more competitive and hierarchical.
Oh, wow. So it sounds like there were some pretty big differences in how aggression played out in these different groups.
Yeah, for sure. And the Dogu Islanders, they were really suspicious of outsiders and believed in witchcraft, which, often led to conflict.
So if these early hunter-gatherer groups were relatively peaceful, then something must have happened, right? What caused that shift towards more, I don't know, destructive forms of aggression?
Well, it points to a pretty major turning point, the Neolithic Revolution. The shift from a nomadic hunter-gatherer lifestyle to a more settled agricultural one.
Oh, that makes sense when you think about it. I mean, suddenly you've got land ownership,
Yeah.
the ability to accumulate resources. It seems like that would create a lot of potential for conflict.
Exactly. And with those changes came new forms of aggression, driven by things like, well, power, possessions, controlling other people. Fromm actually distinguishes between this kind of aggression, which he calls malignant aggression, and the benign aggression that's necessary for things like, self-defense.
So like a hunter killing an animal to feed their family would be benign aggression,
Mm-hmm.
but a warlord conquering a bunch of villages to expand their territory, that would be malignant aggression.
Exactly. And, to understand this malignant aggression, Fromm introduces a concept that might seem kind of unsettling at first. It's this idea of the necrophilus character.
Okay, albeit necrophilia literally means love of death, right? So how does that play into all of this?
Yeah, it's a strong word for sure. And it's important to understand that Fromm isn't using it in a purely literal sense, like an attraction to corpses or something. He's talking about a certain type of personality, a character orientation that's drawn to death, decay, and destroying life, but like in a much broader sense, you know?
Okay, so what does that look like in real life? How does someone with this necrophilic character actually behave?
Well, Fromm gives some pretty striking examples. He talks about people having recurring dreams full of like really vivid imagery of dismemberment, coldness, this desire to control and manipulate others. Like their whole personality is kind of fixated on order and control to the point where they want to eliminate anything that seems, I don't know, too alive or spontaneous.
That's pretty intense. I can see where this is going.
Mm.
So Fromm saw a link between this necrophilic character and what he called malignant aggression.
Exactly. He believed that people with these necrophilous tendencies were more likely to engage in really destructive behavior, especially on a larger scale. And, well, this is where his analysis gets really, really interesting. He actually uses Adolf Hitler as a potential case study for this type of personality.
Wow, that's a bold claim. I'm really curious to hear more about how Fromm backs that up.
Hmm.
So, using Hitler to illustrate this necrophilic character, it's a bold move to say the least.
Yeah.
But what exactly did Fromm see there? What aspects of Hitler's life made him think of this personality type?
Well, it's important to remember that Fromm is very clear that he's not making an official diagnosis from afar. He even says as much in the book. But he does draw some parallels between Hitler's life and this concept of the necrophilic character.
Okay, so what are some of those parallels?
For one thing, there's Hitler's obsession with control. I mean, that's well documented, right? And then there's his utter lack of empathy, especially for people he saw as different or inferior. And of course, his fascination with death and destruction.
Yeah, I can see how that lines up with Fromm's idea of wanting to eliminate anything lively or spontaneous. It's like this deep-seated need to dominate and control everything, to make it all lifeless and uniform.
Exactly. And this is where Fromm's work gets really, really relevant for us today, because he's not just trying to psychoanalyze a dictator from the past. He's warning us about these destructive urges that exist in all of us to some degree, and how those urges can manifest in society at large.
That's a chilling but important point.
Yeah.
So it's not just about identifying these so-called necrophilic characters walking among us. It's about recognizing the social and cultural conditions that allow those tendencies to flourish, right?
Precisely. Fromm was really concerned about systems that, I don't know how to put it, systems that glorify power, dehumanize entire groups of people, and discourage individuality and critical thinking. He saw those as breeding grounds for what he called malignant aggression.
It's a scary thought, for sure.
Yeah.
But Fromm doesn't leave us completely without hope, does he? I mean, is there any way to combat these destructive impulses, both within ourselves and in the world around us?
That's the big question, right? And thankfully, Fromm does offer some hope. He reminds us that just as we have this capacity for necrophilia, this attraction to death and destruction, we also have an innate biophilia, which is this love of life, a drive towards creativity and connection.
So it's this constant tug of war between those two forces within us.
Yeah, kind of. And the key, according to Fromm, is to nurture that biophilic side, that life-affirming part of ourselves, to cultivate things like empathy, compassion, critical thinking. Those are the tools we need to resist those more destructive impulses.
Wow, this has been, I don't know, a very intense deep dive, to say the least. We've covered a lot of ground. From debunking the myth of aggression as purely instinctual, to exploring how aggression played out in those early societies, to grappling with the really unsettling idea of this necrophilic character.
It's definitely a lot to process, that's for sure.
It really is. But on that note, I want to thank you for joining me on this journey into the heart of human aggression. It's been a challenging but important conversation, and one that I think we all need to be having. And to our listeners, thanks for tuning in. We'll leave you with this final thought from Sound. He said, "The question is not whether we are capable of destroying life, our own or that of others, for unfortunately, we know that we are. The question is whether we are able to create, to respect life, to love it." So until next time, keep those questions coming and keep searching for those answers.